I never thought I'd be the kind of man who sets a trap for his own son-in-law. I spent 41 years working for the city of Edmonton, maintaining water infrastructure in weather that would make most people quit before lunch. I raised my daughter on my own after her mother passed. I fixed what was broken. I showed up when it mattered, and I kept my word. That's the kind of man I am. Or so I thought, until the day I realized I also had to be the kind of man who watches and waits and says nothing, because saying something too early would ruin everything. My daughter's name is Sandra. She's 34, and she has her mother's eyes and her mother's stubbornness, which I mean as the highest compliment. She met her husband Dennis at a work function in Calgary. He was charming the way certain men are charming, effortlessly, and for everyone in the room at once. The first time she brought him home to my place in St. Albert, he shook my hand too firmly and complimented my tools in the garage without knowing what any of them were. I smiled. I offered him coffee, and something at the back of my neck went very still, the way it does when you've been working underground long enough to know that stillness before a pipe bursts. I didn't say anything to Sandra. She was happy in a way I hadn't seen her be happy in years, and I wasn't going to be the father who poisons that with a feeling I couldn't even name. Dennis worked in commercial real estate. He dressed well. He knew how to talk about wine and hockey in the same breath, and he always had a reason why he couldn't quite make it on time, or couldn't quite commit to a date, or couldn't quite explain where a particular deal had gone. Sandra called it his entrepreneurial spirit. I called it something else, privately. They got married in the summer, out near Elk Island, a small ceremony, just family and close friends. I walked her down a path between the spruce trees, and her face was so bright it almost hurt to look at. I danced with her at the reception, and I thought maybe I'm wrong about him. Maybe this old man's instincts have finally rusted through. I was not wrong. It started small, the way these things always do. Dennis began coming around to my place more often, but Sandra was rarely with him. He'd stop by on a Tuesday evening, on his way back from a meeting, and he'd sit at my kitchen table and make conversation while I finished eating. He asked about my pension, specifically, the amount, the structure, whether it was indexed to inflation. I told him I didn't really keep track of the numbers, which was a lie, but a useful one. He asked about my property. I own my house outright, bought it in 1987 with money I saved for 11 years, and he asked whether I'd ever thought about downsizing, now that it was just me. I told him I liked my yard. He smiled like I'd said something endearing. Then he started asking about my savings account, my TFSA, whether I had investments outside of work or just the defined benefit plan. I told him I wasn't much of a finance person, which was also a lie. I have a spreadsheet going back 22 years. I know exactly what I have and where it is, because after Sandra's mother got sick, I swore I'd never be the person who didn't know what his own life looked like on paper. Dennis was building a picture. I could feel it the way you feel a change in pressure before a storm. He was adding things up, quietly, politely, with that easy smile that Sandra trusted completely. One evening he asked me, very casually, whether I had a safety deposit box at the bank. I told him I used to, but I'd closed it years ago. I watched his face. Something shifted behind his eyes, a small recalibration. He nodded and changed the subject. I called my old colleague Frank the next morning. Frank retired from the city the year before I did, and he's one of those people who just naturally knows how things work. Banking, law, property. We've been friends for 30 years. I told him what had been happening, and Frank was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Earl, you need to talk to someone at the branch." Earl is my name. I've lived with it long enough to like it. I went to my branch at TD on St. Nuss, Albert Trail that week, and I spoke to an advisor named Corinne, who I'd dealt with for years. I explained the situation carefully. She listened without interrupting, which I appreciated. And then she told me some things I already suspected, and a few things I didn't. We made a plan together. It took about an hour. I shook her hand when I left, and I felt something I hadn't felt in months, which was that I was no longer just watching something happen. I was part of what was going to happen next. In the meantime, I kept behaving exactly as Dennis expected me to. I mentioned offhandedly one evening that I had some important documents I'd been meaning to organize. Insurance papers, the deed to the house, some old account information. I said I kept them in a lockbox in the bedroom closet. I rubbed the back of my neck and said I was getting forgetful, that I could never remember where I'd put the key. I watched Dennis pour himself more coffee, and I could see him trying not to look too interested. A week later, I mentioned that I'd found the key and put it in the small ceramic dish on my dresser, next to the lamp. I said this to Sandra and Dennis together at Sunday dinner, and I kept my voice distracted, like a man saying something and already forgetting it. Sandra asked me if I wanted her to come over and help me sort through things. Dennis said, "Let him do it when he's ready. He knows where everything is." He said it gently, protectively, like he was taking care of me. Sandra looked at him with something close to admiration, and I pressed my fork into my potatoes and said nothing. He came 2 days later. I wasn't there. I was at Frank's place, which Dennis didn't know. I had installed a small security camera the week before, positioned to cover the dresser and the closet. It was a simple unit, nothing fancy, linked to my phone. I could see everything. He let himself in with a spare key Sandra had given him after the wedding, which at the time had seemed like a normal family thing to do. He moved through my house the way people move when they think they're alone, with a kind of loose confidence, touching things, looking around without pretending not to look. He went to the bedroom. He found the ceramic dish. He found the key. The lockbox was in the closet, where I'd said. He brought it to the bed and opened it. I want to tell you what he expected to find. He expected account numbers, access codes, information he could use, not necessarily to steal outright, but to build leverage, to understand exactly what I had and how to position himself to benefit from it. Dennis wasn't, I think, a man who planned a single dramatic crime. He was a man who accumulated advantages slowly, quietly, until one day you looked up and realized he had everything and you didn't know how it happened. What he found instead was a letter. I had written it myself at my kitchen table over the course of 3 evenings. It took that long because I wanted every word to be right. The letter explained, calmly and in plain language, exactly what I knew. That I had recorded every conversation in which he had asked about my finances. That I had already spoken to my bank advisor, and that Corinne had helped me restructure my accounts, add a trusted contact designation, and flag any unusual access requests. That I had met with a lawyer and updated my will. That the letter, along with a copy of the security footage and a log of his visits and questions, had been filed with my lawyer and would be sent to Sandra if anything happened to me or if I instructed it. That he had exactly one choice, to be a decent husband to my daughter or to leave quietly, and that if he tried a third option, the documentation was comprehensive enough to be very embarrassing, and possibly more than that. Underneath the letter was a single photograph. It was Sandra and me from years ago at her high school graduation. She's wearing a green dress and laughing at something I'd just said, and I've got my arm around her shoulders, and I'm looking at her like she's the best thing I ever did, which she is. I put it there on purpose. I wanted him to have to look at it. I watched on my phone as he sat on the edge of my bed for a very long time. He didn't take anything. He put the letter back. He closed the lockbox. He returned it to the closet and the key to the dish. And he walked out of my house and sat in his car in the driveway for 11 minutes. I watched that too. He called Sandra that evening, and I don't know what he said because I wasn't there, but I know that whatever it was, Sandra seemed troubled in the days that followed. She called me more than usual. She asked me how I was doing with a weight in her voice that hadn't been there before. I answered honestly. I said I was fine, that I had things in order, that she didn't need to worry about me. 3 weeks later, she came to my house alone in the afternoon and sat down at my kitchen table with both hands wrapped around a mug of tea and told me her marriage was in trouble. She didn't give me details. She said she'd realized some things about Dennis that she was still working through. Her voice was steady, but her eyes were doing what they do when she's holding something together by willpower alone, which is something she got from me. I didn't tell her about the lockbox, or the letter, or the camera. I don't know if I ever will. What I told her was that she was the wisest person I knew, and that whatever she decided, I would be there. She put her head on my shoulder for a moment, the way she used to when she was small, and I sat very still and felt the weight of her there and thought about all the things a person carries and doesn't say. Dennis moved out 2 months after that. Sandra filed for separation in February through a family lawyer in Edmonton. The process is ongoing, and I stay out of it except when she asks me to come with her to appointments, which I do. I sit in the waiting room with a paperback and a terrible coffee, and I am there when she comes out. Frank came over for dinner last week. We had venison stew that I'd been slow cooking all day, and we sat at the table where Dennis had asked about my pension, and Frank raised his glass and said, "To knowing where the key is." I laughed. It was the real kind, the kind that comes up from somewhere low. I am 68 years old. I spent 4 decades underground, in the cold and the dark, keeping the water moving for a city full of people who never once thought about where it came from. I know how systems work. I know what pressure looks like before it becomes a problem. And I know that the most dangerous thing a person can do, the most dangerous thing anyone ever did to me, is assume that because someone is old and quiet, they are not paying attention. I was always paying attention. I think about that ceramic dish a lot. Something so small, a little blue thing Sandra painted in grade 6, chipped on one side, and it became the hinge the whole thing turned on. Not a courtroom, not a confrontation, not a single raised voice. Just a key, a lockbox, and a letter written at a kitchen table over 3 quiet evenings. People ask me sometimes, not about this story, because I haven't told many people, but in general, how you're supposed to handle it when someone close to you turns out to be something different than you thought. I never have a clean answer. What I know is that how you respond to that moment says more about you than anything they did. Dennis made his choices out of greed, out of a belief that an old man alone in a house in St. Albert was a problem to be solved, rather than a person to be reckoned with. And I made mine out of something quieter, which was just a refusal to be diminished. That refusal is the thing I'd want anyone to take from this. Not strategy, not tricks, just the understanding that your integrity, your sense of what is right and what you owe to the people you love, is not something that weakens with age. If anything, it sharpens. You've had longer to understand what it costs to lose it. I spent 4 decades doing work that nobody saw, underground, in the cold, because that work kept a city running, and that was enough reason to do it well. You don't do that for 40 years without developing a fairly clear idea of who you are and what you stand for. And then there's Sandra. Watching her work through what happened without knowing the full picture has been one of the harder things. She's figuring it out on her own terms, the way I always hoped she would, because that's what real strength looks like. Not the absence of pain, but the decision to move through it with your head up. I sat in that lawyer's waiting room in February with a terrible coffee and a paperback I wasn't really reading, and I thought about her mother, and I thought about all the years it took to raise a person who could handle something like this and not collapse. That's not nothing. That's the whole thing, actually. What I'd say to anyone in a situation like this, feeling watched, feeling like someone in your own circle is quietly measuring what you have, is don't panic and don't go silent. Those are both traps. What you do is think clearly, act deliberately, and trust that a life lived with honesty gives you more tools than you realize. The record you've built, the relationships, the reputation, the simple fact of having been reliable for decades, that's not invisible. It's infrastructure. And infrastructure, as I know better than most, holds when the pressure comes. Frank raised his glass and said, "To knowing where the key is." I think what he meant was something bigger than a key. He meant knowing yourself well enough that when someone tries to get the better of you, they find out, very quietly, very completely, that they never had a chance.